Human beings make hierarchies, nobles and commoners, tsars and serfs, emperors and slaves. In ancient Israel, when the Jerusalem temple stood, there were a series of interconnected courts that defined the hierarchies of the society. The outermost court was the court for all the other nations. In Hebrew, by the way, the word for the other nations is goyim. It's the non-Jews. It's everybody else, as if the world were us and all of them. The next court in was the court for Judean women, and that was as close as they could get to the center of the shrine. Then another court for the regular Judean men, who could go closer than the women, but no further. And then there was a court open to the Levites, the temple attendants. But then there was a court beyond the Levite court that the Levites could not enter, and that was the court for the Kohanim, for the priests. And then in the center of that court for the priests was the Holy of Holies, the very center of the shrine in Jerusalem, and into that space only the high priest was allowed, and only once a year on Yom Kippur. Now, if you were a priest or a Levite, you could descend in your status, but you could never ascend. There was no test to become a priest. It was a matter of pedigree. In Yiddish, you would have called it yichus, the status conferred on you by your ancestors. Now, after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, some privileges and a few responsibilities remained for priestly families like Levines and Cohens, any people who claimed descent from those tribes. But a new clergy emerged in Jewish life, the role of rabbi. And to become a rabbi, that was open to all men initially, and by the late 20th century, to all Jews of all genders. Hierarchies happen in high schools. Hierarchies happen on sports teams. They happen in fraternities and sororities. They happen in political parties. Just last week in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about India and how people in certain professions put a sticker describing their profession on their windshield to show their status and give them precedence in driving their cars. Now, if a hierarchy is based on demonstrated skill and knowledge, or based on one's usefulness, or based on simply a practical division of labor, then maybe a hierarchy is justified. But most human hierarchies historically have not been justified. They've been based on bias. They've been based on our gut reactions. They've been based on personal connections and who knows who. They've been based on advantages of wealth and that sticky term privilege. All of those have affected who's on top and who's on the bottom. Hierarchies are not just a question of individual choice of who you like more. A hierarchy is a social network. It's a system. And the key question that author Isabel Wilkerson explores in Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, is with different vocabulary, but is there a systematic racial hierarchy in America today? Not was there a racist system during slavery, of course there was, or during Jim Crow laws, of course it was a racist system, from the 1600s to the 1960s. That's not really a debate. But what Wilkerson asks more provocatively is there a racial caste system in America even today, with white men on top and African Americans on the bottom? And is maybe the concept of caste a more accurate way to diagnose the problem? She raises the question at the very beginning of her book. Looking beneath the history of one's country is like learning that alcoholism or depression runs in one's family, or that suicide has occurred more often than might be usual, or with the advances in medical genetics, discovering that one has inherited the markers of the BRCA mutation for breast cancer. You don't ball up in a corner with guilt or shame at these discoveries. You don't, if you are wise, forbid any mention of them. In fact, you do the opposite. You educate yourself. You talk to people who have been through it and to specialists who have researched it. You learn the consequences and the obstacles, the options and the treatment. You may pray over it and meditate over it. Then you take precautions to protect yourself and succeeding generations and work to ensure that these things, whatever they are, don't happen again. Now, Wilkerson is very aware, and we are very aware, that some people resist such a claim, that there is a caste system, a hierarchy system at work in American society even today. For example, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Roberts famously wrote that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Stop looking, stop asking. You can see it today in the resistance to DEI initiatives and education on the subject. Now, why are people resistant to exploring this question? Well, if it is a systematic racist system, if it is a caste system, then it's unfixable without radical change. It means changing a lot. And it implicates everyone, including our founders and our ancestors, maybe even our grandparents or our parents who benefited from that system, and maybe even ourselves as current participants. Maybe it's easier to blame those few cross-burning radicals who are unrepentant racists. That's racism. That's easier to focus on the outliers. If we say the problems are in the past, then it doesn't have to be our fault. It doesn't make us feel guilty. And Wilkerson says that that may be true, that we are not guilty today of doing it ourselves, but that's no excuse to not think about it. Americans are loath to talk about enslavement in part because what little we know about it goes against our perception of our country as a just and enlightened nation, a beacon of democracy in the world. Slavery is commonly dismissed as a sad, dark chapter in the country's history. It is as if the greater the distance we can create between slavery and ourselves, the better to stave off the guilt or shame it induces. But in the same way that individuals cannot move forward, become whole and healthy, unless they examine the domestic violence they saw as children, or the alcoholism that runs in their family, the country cannot become whole unless it confronts what was not just a chapter in its history, but the basis of its economic and social order. For a quarter millennium, slavery was the country. In this book, Wilkerson, who began as a New York Times journalist and then was the author of the fabulous book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North and the Far West, she brings together historical arguments and sources, a number of statistics, and especially she brings to bear anecdotes that others have told her and her own experience. She does a wonderful job telling these stories in a way that anyone can understand. There's in fact an entire chapter just collecting her experiences of flying first class as a black woman and the kind of problems she ran into in that. So I want to read to you one example she brings at the end of the book that is, again, a marvelous retelling of something that happened to her. She went out to dinner with a family friend at a chic restaurant in a hip section of an American city. This woman, she didn't know her particularly well, but she was a free spirit, kind-hearted, well-traveled. And she was also from the dominant caste. That's what Wilkerson uses for white. She doesn't say white, she says the dominant caste. This woman was also from the dominant caste and had grown up in a neighborhood surrounded by people mainly like herself. As we sat catching up on each other's lives that each of us had only known from afar, several waiters passed by, and it was unclear which one was ours. Finally, a waiter stopped at our table. He was blonde, curt, and matter-of-fact. I ordered fish, she ordered pasta. We both ordered drinks, an appetizer or two. While we waited for the drinks to arrive, a couple from the dominant caste, same caste as her, sat down at the table next to us. Our waiter rushed over to take their order, now charming and effusive, filling them in on the specials, chatting them up. Seconds later, he brought a basket of bread to their table. He brought them their drinks shortly thereafter, while we sipped water and waited for ours. The family friend was growing impatient, seething actually, and turned to see where he was. She was trying to process an unaccustomed disregard. The waiter rolled around to check on the people next to us yet again and to deliver drinks and bread to other tables down the row. Trying to keep calm, she motioned for him to come over. "We haven't gotten our drinks yet," she said. "Can you bring us our drinks, please? And we'd like bread, too," she added, looking over at the couple who had arrived after us. They were now dipping their bread in olive oil as we stared at an empty table. He nodded and said sure, but stopped to check on several other tables on his way back to the kitchen, which delayed him further. He reappeared later with dishes on his tray, but these were now the appetizers for the couple at the next table. The family friend motioned to him again. "Our drinks, and we never got the bread." "Oh, right, sure," he said, turning back again. It was now hard for her to concentrate on whatever it was she was saying. The people next to us were remarking on how good the appetizers were, and had all but finished their bread. Their table was laden, and ours was empty, and she seemed exquisitely aware of the couple beside us, that they were passing us on the escalator of dining attention. On one of his many rounds past our table, the waiter at last brought the drinks but not the bread, and the exclusion was now impossible to ignore. Finally, he showed up with the entrees. The people next to us were on to their desserts, which were lovely, apparently, from what they were saying. She stared at the pasta and jostled it with her fork, tasted it, and set the fork down. "Pasta's cold. It's not even good. How's your fish?" "It's okay, not great. Mine's cold too." "I'm getting the waiter." Her face was now approaching crimson. She fidgeted in her seat and looked around for him, shaking her head in disbelief. She was barely able to keep it together. "Can you come here a second?" she called out to him as he passed again. "I know exactly what this is about. This is about racism." Her voice was rising. She was loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "You are a racist. This restaurant is racist. We sat here all this time, and you served all those other people at all those other tables, and you ignored us this whole time just because she's African American." People at other tables were now looking over at me, Isabel Wilkerson, when I had not wanted the attention. I had no interest in making a federal case out of this. If I responded like that every time I was slighted, I'd be telling someone off almost every day. But she was just getting started. "I want your name. I want the manager's name. I will turn this place out." She pushed the bowl of pasta to the center of the table. "The pasta's cold," she said. "I can't even eat it. Her fish is cold. She can't eat hers. I'm not paying. We're not paying. I'm telling everybody I know not to come here. This is crap." With all of the ruckus, the manager came out to see what was going on. As it happened, the manager was a petite African-American woman who seemed cowed by the ferocity of this newly minted anti-racist, anti-casteist upper-caste woman, standing before her enraged at the unaccustomed humiliation. The manager apologized profusely, but my friend was having none of it. She stormed out of the restaurant, and I walked out with her. It took a while for her to calm down. Part of me wanted to say to her, "Imagine going through something like this almost every day, not knowing when or how it might happen. You wouldn't last very long. We can't afford to be blowing up every time we're slighted and ignored. We stand up when we need to, but we have to find a way not to go off every time and still get through the day." Part of me resented that she could go ballistic and get away with it when I might not even be believed. It was caste privilege to go off in the restaurant the way she did. It was a measure of how differently we are treated that she could live over 40 years and not experience what is a daily possibility for any person born in the subordinate caste, that it was so alien to her, it so jangled her that she blew up over it. But part of me wished that every person in the dominant caste who denies and deflects, minimizes and gaslights African Americans and other marginalized people could experience what she did. She had been radicalized in a matter of minutes. She knew full well this was not how people treated her when she was out with others in the dominant caste. She had come to this realization on her own. And part of me, the biggest part of me, was happy to see her righteous indignation on my behalf, on her own behalf, and on behalf of all the people who endure these indignities every day. It would be a better world if everyone could feel what she felt for once and awaken. What a storyteller, right? Well, what is a caste system? A caste system, according to Wilkerson, gotta get the right page. There we go. A caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste, whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groups apart, distinct from one another in their assigned places. Now, we prefer to focus on racism as an individual flaw, but the reality is that we fool ourselves into thinking that we are rooting out injustice by pursuing the individual racist and asking them for an apology that is, as she writes, is not likely to come, focuses on the individual instead of the system, and gives cover to those people who can present themselves as noble for having pointed the finger first, but keeping the hierarchy intact. But caste has survived the end of formal state-sponsored racism. Jim Crow is 65 years old or more, depending on what state. But perhaps that structural system, that hierarchy, survives. The modern-day version of easily deniable racism may be able to cloak the invisible structure that created and maintains the hierarchy and inequality. Caste is the structure. Caste is the ranking and the boundaries. Consider the concept of caste in the Hindu system. At the very bottom, you have what are called the Dalit, the untouchables. And you have various levels up to the top, defining profession and status and privilege and education. These roles in that caste system, and particularly for the Dalit, for the untouchables on the bottom, define their possessions, define their professions, define even their personal family names. People who come from this world of caste in India know by last name what caste you belong to. It's coded in your very personal identity. And think about that concept of being untouchable, of being polluting. You know, in India, the untouchables are also not allowed to touch things that the upper castes would use because it renders them unclean. Think about the African American experience during Jim Crow, where they couldn't go swimming in the same swimming pools because it would pollute the pool for the whites. Or even in the lake. You may know that in 1919 there were terrible race riots in Chicago that were initially sparked by a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan in the wrong part of Lake Michigan. And the line needed to be drawn. No shared bathrooms, no shared hotels, no shared neighborhoods, no shared bus seats. Often African Americans had to pay in the front and then enter in the back so they didn't walk past the white patrons sitting in the front. Blacks had to be in subordinate jobs or else they'd be accused of being uppity. And there was no mixing, no socialization, let alone sex or marriage. This is a world of untouchability for that community. And it was especially psychically important to those near the bottom, other non-white immigrants, or especially poor whites. In 1913, a Southern educator wrote, "Let the lowest white man count for more than the highest Negro." And for other groups like Asians or Latinos who were stuck in the middle, they, as she puts it in one of her chapters, they were in a race to get under the white tent because maybe that would give them some kind of advantage. And one Asian American writer wrote with chagrin that it was just a matter of an apostrophe that separated the Japanese O'Hara from the Irish O'Hara. and one could be a citizen and one could not. After all, the Jews went through that experience too. There's a wonderful book of sociology, I think the author's name is Karen Brodsky, something like that. It's called How Jews Became White Folk. Because at one time, Jews were not welcome in white America, and then post-World War II, gradually, we were. And that was racing for the white tent, but who is left behind? Now, why is this issue of a racial caste and a racial system in America of relevance to Jews? Well, first of all, there are black Jews. So they are us. It is not just a them and us dynamic, even if most American Jews are Ashkenazi, European background, and present as white to the world. Secondly, there's a basic human consideration as a human being, living in a world, concerned with your friends and neighbors and what happens in your society. We should know what's happening around us. And third, it turns out that in the 1930s, the Nazi government, animated by anti-Semitism, studied American law and the American racism or caste system as a basis for writing their own Nuremberg laws and separationist laws. They studied a bit of South Africa's pre-apartheid segregation system in the 30s. It wasn't officially apartheid till after the war. But American law in particular was a model for legalized racial separation and purity. As one example, a book written in 1922 by a Harvard PhD named Lothrop Stoddard was called The Revolt Against Civilization, the Menace of the Underman. When that was translated into German, that became the Untermensch, the subhuman. And that concept became dominant in Nazi racial ideology. The models of segregating communities, the virtue of public violence, of keeping the group in their place, be it a lynching or a public pogrom, Kristallnacht, whatever you call it. Preventing intermarriage. One of the first Nuremberg laws was preventing the marriage of Jews to, quote, Aryans. The basic process of stripping the rights of a citizen through legal means. You see, this is the tragedy of the Jim Crow world, is it was legal. It was passed in law. It wasn't simply done outside of law. Some of it was. The lynching was. The extrajudicial violence was. But so much of the caste system was part of law as well as custom. The Nazis learned from all of it. One even proposed in an early conference in 1934 that they should define Jewishness for the Third Reich as 1/16 Jewish. So one grandparent out of all your grandparents. Or is that even one great-grandparent out of all your great-grandparents? And they proposed this because they did not want to be less rigorous than the Americans were. Where in some parts of America, even one drop of African-American blood was enough to mark one as part of that lower caste. In fact, that famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the separate but equal category, they chose a plaintiff, Mr. Plessy, who appeared white. He was, I think, 1/8, an octoroon was the term of the day. And they chose it particularly to point out how ridiculous the law was. And when it got to the Supreme Court, the separate but unequal was affirmed. Now, we have to admit, there are limits to the Nazi and American caste situation comparison. Yes, there were labor camps in the Third Reich, and there were labor camps on the plantations. There were pogrom violence in both. But there were no mass gas chambers here for the African American population. There were no death camps designed for murder. And from later views of history, there's also a difference. She describes the experience of an American historian living in Germany who grew up in the South, and comparing how Americans remember the Confederacy with how Germans remember the Third Reich. In America, the men who mounted a bloody civil war against the United States to keep the right to enslave humans for generations went on to live out their retirement in comfort. Confederate President Jefferson Davis went on to write his memoirs at a plantation in Mississippi that is now the site of a presidential library. Robert E. Lee became an esteemed college president. And when they died, they were both granted state funerals with military honors and were revered with statues and monuments. She describes at length the steps it took for New Orleans to remove a Confederate statue in the middle of the night after threat after threat after threat was thrown at any contractor who dared to explore doing the job. It had to be done in the middle of the night with people wearing masks so nobody would know who was actually doing it. An American author living in Berlin who happens to be Jewish and to have been raised in the South often gets asked about Germany's memorials to its Nazi past. To which I respond, she says, there aren't any. Germany has no monuments that celebrate the Nazi armed forces, however many grandfathers fought or fell for them. Rather than honor supremacists with statues on pedestals, Germany, after decades of silence and soul-searching, chose to erect memorials to the victims of its aggressions and to the courageous people who resisted the men who inflicted atrocities on human beings. A different approach to the past, for sure. The core of the book is the 8 pillars of caste. And we're going to focus on some of them, but not all of them. But I want you to understand how she sketches out this argument that there is a caste system in America. And as I read them, I want you to ask yourself, is this still operative today? It could have been, maybe, but is it still around today? Is it still animating human behavior? The first basis of caste, certainly in the traditional Indian system, is divine will and the law of nature. It's based on the Hindu reincarnation system, right? If you're in a class, if you're in a caste, it's because you deserve it. In your past life, you were good. You're in a high caste, you were bad. You were in a low caste, you're living out the just deserts of your behavior. And if you behave in the caste you find yourself in, you have a chance to move up the next time around. So you're always working for the next life and suffering in this one if you're on the bottom. Slavery was described as the curse of Ham, the curse of Ham in the Hebrew Bible, where Ham is the son of Noah who violates Noah's privacy, dignity, and so he is cursed to be a slave and a servant to his brothers. If you read the laws of slavery described in the Torah, you can have a slave who's a Hebrew for a limited period of time, but after 7 years, they're allowed to go free. But a slave from the outsiders, they can be a slave for life. And chattel slavery, where their children become slaves too. Religion supports the system. The second pillar is what she calls heritability. And that is that your caste comes to you from your birth, not by a test, not by natural proclivities, but simply by birth. Each caste system relied on clear lines of demarcation in which everyone was ascribed a rank at birth and a role to perform, as if each person were a molecule in a self-perpetuating organism. You were born to a certain caste and remained in that caste, subject to the high status or the low stigma it conferred for the rest of your days and into the lives of your descendants. In India, it was generally the father who passed the rank to his children. In America, dating back to colonial Virginia, children inherited the caste of their mother, both by law and by custom. And in disputes about those parameters, a child was generally to take the status of a lower-ranking parent. It turns out this breaks from English legal precedent. For the colonies, it was the father's status that defined it. But now in Virginia, they declared in 1662 that if there's any doubt, the child born will be held bond or free according to the condition of their mother. This allowed enslavers to claim the children of black women, and they became property for life. It also invited them to rape and impregnate the women, if they were so inclined, to make them even richer. It converted the black womb into a profit center and drew sharper lines around the subordinate caste, as neither mother nor child could make a claim against an upper-caste man, and no child springing from a black womb could escape condemnation to the lowest rung. It created a bipolar hierarchy of whites and non-whites, and anyone deemed black was based on any physical manifestation of African ancestry. So hereditability. Think about the Nazi laws, right? That were worried about one parent, one grandparent who was Jewish, creating a permanent taint where previous anti-Judaisms might have allowed you out if you converted. You know, in medieval Spain, if you converted out, well, maybe you could make your way in the church. Although even in Spain, they came up with a concept they called limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, that tracked who was a new Christian and who was an old Christian. Well, maybe it was a problem then too. But it certainly was a problem in the Nazi era, where you could have a nun, a Catholic nun named Edith Stein, be deported to Auschwitz and killed because she was born Jewish, and because of that biological taint, according to the Nazis, she would always be Jewish. A third pillar, endogamy and the control of marriage and mating. You need clear lines between who is what. Otherwise, the facade collapses. And if you have no prospect of marrying someone from the other caste, it reduces your concept of empathy. Endogamy enforces caste boundaries by forbidding marriage outside of one's group and going so far as to prohibit sexual relations or even the appearance of romantic interest across caste lines. It builds a firewall between castes and becomes the primary means of keeping resources and affinity within each tier of the caste system. Endogamy, by closing off legal family connection, blocks the chance for empathy or a sense of shared destiny between the castes. It means it's much less likely that someone in the dominant caste will have a personal stake in the happiness, fulfillment, or well-being of anyone deemed beneath them, or anyone personally identified with them or their plight. Once you have those lines that you cannot cross, they become other, because they're not going to be part of us. It's impossible for them to become part of us. Loving versus Virginia, the ruling that allowed interracial marriage and canceled the laws that still existed in, I believe, 13 states at the time, that was in 1967. That's not that long ago. But I'll point out one other data point that she also mentions in the book. In the year 2000, the state of Alabama decided to finally take the provision out of their constitution. It was a moot point because of the Supreme Court, but they figured, let's just cancel the law anyways. And their proposition to remove their ban of interracial marriage from their state constitution did pass, but 40% voted against removing it. They wanted to keep it in the Constitution, just for a statement, or a value, or to preserve the system. Another pillar of the caste system is occupational hierarchy. You prohibit certain higher professions or financial independence to the lower caste. They're forced to have the lower status stores, the lower status professions as they're working. It reflects their caste status. It's the case for the untouchables who do the jobs that no one else wants to do. The Nazis also banned Jews from certain professions and over time from more and more professions. And African Americans also had to face this limitation of possibilities for themselves. Here's an example in India. In India, where there are thousands of castes, within the four major castes, no one occupation has but one caste assigned to it. In theory, caste demands occupational specialization, but in practice, the most ideally organized of the castes, the Brahmins, have a wide variety of occupations. But in America, on the other hand, the lines were very, very stark. In 1890, 85% of black men and 96% of black women were employed in just two occupational categories: agriculture or domestic or personal service. Those were the jobs for the vast majority of black men and black women. And 40 years later, in 1930, when the Depression set in and African Americans began to move to the north, the percent at the bottom remained basically the same. Nearly half of black men were doing manual labor that didn't call for any education or skill. And only 5% were listed as white-collar workers. Many of them ministers, teachers, and small business owners who catered to other black people. And so it was a world of occupational hierarchy that reflected the social hierarchy. It was a reinforcing system. Another pillar, dehumanization and stigma. People in the African American community were subject to the use of force within the law or beyond the law, even to the point of death. They weren't respected by their real names. When they were made into slaves, they were given new names, not the names they came with. And of course, they were called boy. far beyond their age deserved. This happened, of course, as well in the concentration camp world, where names were removed and numbers were given instead. Think of the language that was used in those concentration camps of extermination, delousing, all of the dehumanization process, taking away their language, not allowing them to speak it. Inhuman levels of food, so small, both for the African American slaves, but also, of course, for the concentration camps. The kind of clothing that they were able to wear. In one place in Virginia, they specified which kind of materials African Americans were allowed to put on, just to differentiate them from everyone else and to have the cheapest, roughest, least comfortable options. And of course, the concentration camp uniform also reminds us of how different they were, not to mention being subject to medical experiments and how dehumanizing that is. In the end, of course, the result of this was dehumanization. If you dehumanize the group, you have completed the work of dehumanizing any single person within it. Dehumanize the group and you've quarantined them from the masses you choose to elevate and have programmed everyone, even the targets of dehumanization, to no longer believe what their eyes can see and no longer trust their own thoughts. Dehumanization distances not only the out-group from the in-group, but those in the in-group from their own humanity. It makes slaves to groupthink of everyone in the hierarchy. A caste system relies on dehumanization to lock the marginalized outside of the norms of humanity, so any action against them is seen as reasonable. The last two pillars, terror as enforcement, violence and terror to preempt resistance and enforce compliance, and even encouraging members of the lower caste to be part of the system of control through the capos, the slave drivers. And finally, a belief in inherent superiority and inherent inferiority, reinforced by constant reminders and required behavior. In both Nazi Europe and in the Dalit world in India and in the American system, the lower caste could not use the sidewalk in the presence of someone of the higher caste. They couldn't wear fancier clothes or drive better cars or own nicer homes. The Dalit have a code for the number of folds and length of the women's saris that they're allowed to wear. This reminds me, by the way, of the experience of Jews historically living under Islam for many centuries. They had to live as a subordinate minority called the dhimmi, that often prescribed what they could wear and could they walk on the sidewalk, the same kind of status where you're a second-class person. And this becomes a problem, of course, because what happens if someone who belongs in the lower class actually becomes successful? They're supposed to be lower. They're supposed to deserve it. It's supposed to be justice. It turns out, she writes, that the greatest threat to a caste system is not lower caste failure, which in a caste system is expected and counted on. It's lower class success, which is not. Achievement by those in the lowest caste goes against the script handed down to us all. It undermines the core assumptions upon which a caste system is constructed and to which the identities of people on all rungs of the hierarchy are linked. Achievement by marginalized people who step outside the roles expected of them puts things out of order and triggers primeval and often violent backlash. Have you heard the phrase, an affirmative action hire? A DEI hire? It's inconceivable they could have actually made it on their own merits. The only way that someone like that gay person, that black person, that Latino person, the only way they could have gotten there was by unfair advantage by a crooked system. That's that negative assumption that they have to belong on bottom because that's the way things are. It's impossible they could have made it by merit. And it's reinforced by the depictions in the news and the media. She brings a fascinating example of who do you picture when you think of someone who is poor? A little more than 1 in 5 African Americans, about 22%, are poor. And they make up just about a quarter of the poor people in America, about 27%. But a study looking at what was depicted in the news when they were doing a news story about poor people, 59% of the images of a poor person on the news is someone black. White families make up 2/3 of Americans poor, at 66%, but there are only 17% of poor people shown on the news. That has an impact on the society, but also on the people who see themselves depicted on the screen. Now, Wilkerson wants to map current politics and compare it to this history. Now, one of the weaknesses in the book, I find, is that, you know the story that if you're a hammer, you think everything is a nail? Sometimes, because caste is the focus of the book, everything is due to caste. All the political changes we've seen over the last 8 to 10 years, the rise in white mortality, whether it's through suicide or through opioid addiction, must be based on what she calls dominant group status threat. Their status is being undermined with the rise of multiculturalism and diversity and Barack Obama becoming president, and therefore they're depressed and they're headed down. Well, again, it may be a factor, but it may not be the only factor involved. She does point out, though, that since Lyndon Baines Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, no Democrat has won a majority of the white vote in any election since 1964. The closest was Jimmy Carter, who won 48% of the white vote, and he was a Southerner. Now, this is, as I said, one of the least compelling aspects of the book, where she assumes that the goals of a liberal politics would be the solution to the caste problem she's describing. So she wants to encourage a recognition that caste hurts everyone. So she brings the evidence of the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s, which did not engender a lot of sympathy and empathy and emphasis on treatment as opposed to imprisonment, versus what's happened with the opioid crisis in the 2000s, where now it's all about empathy and sympathy and treatment and not about imprisonment in the masses. And she thought if we had only learned how to do that 30 years ago with the lower caste facing this drug problem, we would be in better shape now for the white caste dealing with it. Well, that argument, I think, holds some weight. But sometimes she also says that that very concept of us versus them thinking is what is causing the lack of a social safety net that we experience in America today. So she quotes a journalist, Jonathan Chait, where he notes that America has a singular indifference, unique among developed nations, towards helping all of its citizens. For example, universal health care. And he connects this hard-heartedness to the hierarchy coming from slavery. He found that even conservatives in other wealthy nations are more compassionate than many Americans. Few industrialized economies provide as stingy aid to the poor as the U.S., he wrote. In none of them is the principle of universal health insurance even contested by a major conservative party. Conservatives have long celebrated America's unique strand of anti-statism as the product of our religiosity or the tradition of English liberty or the searing experience of the tea tax. But the factor that stands above all else is slavery, because a caste system builds rivalry and distrust and lack of empathy towards one fellow. Well, I think the reason we don't have health care in America as a universal right and government program, there's a lot of reasons behind it. And the caste system and a lack of empathy may be a piece of it. But I think it's a little too simplistic to say that it's the primary reason behind it. And so she asks at the beginning and at the end of the book, how could someone like Donald Trump win an election? And she looks at some of the voting data behind it. And she says the 2016 election, where a majority of white women voted against the white woman candidate, is in some ways a map of this caste system she's envisioning. White men voted for Trump at 62%, white women at 53%, Latino men at 32%, Latino women at 25%, African American men at 13%, and black women at 4%. Unlike a majority of white voters, every other group supported the Democrat. White men, only 31% voted for Hillary Clinton. White women, 43%. Latino men, 63%. Latino women, 69%. African American men, 82%. And African American women, whose race and gender put them at the bottom of the caste, supported the white female Democrat by 94%. So she sees the mapping of the parties as the inverse order of caste in America. Well, it's an interesting way to cut the numbers. At the end of the book, she asks, what can we do? And that's the question we might ask if we accept her premise that there is a caste in America that we still have to grapple with, or at least a caste inheritance that we need to fight. What can we do? Well, she begins by saying that we need to understand the racial system in which we live and operate. As familiar as it is to us, it's peculiarly American. It's not the case elsewhere. James Baldwin points out that no one was white before they came to America. And then she meets a Nigerian playwright in London. She came to a talk that was being given at the British Library, and this playwright was intrigued by the lecture, the idea that 6 million African Americans had to seek political asylum within the borders of their own country during the Great Migration, where they had to leave the Deep South and move to places they thought would be better. And she said something that I've never forgotten, Wilkerson writes. You know, there are no black people in Africa. Most Americans, weaned on the myth of drawable lines between human beings, have to sit with that statement. There are no black people in Africa. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course there are black people in Africa. There's a whole continent of black people in Africa. How could anyone not see that? Africans are not black, she said. They are Igbo and Yoruba, Iwe, Akan, Debele. They are not black. They are just themselves. They are humans on the land. That is how they see themselves, and that is who they are. What we take as gospel in American culture is alien to them, she said. They don't become black until they go to America or come to the UK. It is then that they become black. So it's a peculiarly American thing. It's not an indelible human thing. The second lesson she offers is the lesson from the experience of one of the smartest people in the world, who in 1932 had to flee his homeland and move to America. His name was Albert Einstein. He was a refugee from Germany because of anti-Jewish persecution, and his experience led him to have extra empathy for the African Americans that crossed his path. A few years into his tenure at Princeton University, the opera singer Marian Anderson was performing to an overflow crowd at the McCarter Theater in Princeton, and to rapturous praise in the press of her complete mastery of a magnificent voice. But the Nassau Inn at Princeton University refused to rent a room to her for the night. And so Einstein invited her to stay in his home. And from then on, she would stay there whenever she was in town, even after the hotels began accepting African American guests. As he wrote, being a Jew myself, perhaps I can understand and empathize with how black people feel as victims of discrimination. He didn't like how they were treated from his own experiences. He co-chaired a committee to end lynching. He joined the NAACP. He spoke out on behalf of civil rights activists. At a certain point in his life, he rarely accepted the many honors that came his way, but in 1946, he made an exception for Lincoln University, a historically black college in Pennsylvania. He agreed to deliver a commencement address and to accept an honorary degree there. As he told the graduates at their commencement, after having taught his theory of relativity to their physics students and played with the children of black faculty, including someone who would become Julian Bond, later the head of the NAACP, he told the graduates, the separation of the races is not a disease of the colored people, but a disease of the white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it. And so he was an ally of the people consigned to the bottom. That's part of what we need too. Overcoming the caste system with empathy. And in fact, she argues, we need a radical kind of empathy. And here's what she means by radical empathy. Radical empathy means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you've never been in and perhaps never will. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. Empathy is no substitute for experience itself. We don't get to tell a person with a broken leg or a bullet wound that they are not in pain. And people who have hit the caste lottery are not in a position to tell someone who has suffered under the tyranny of caste what is offensive or hurtful or demeaning to those at the bottom. The price of privilege is the moral duty to act when one sees another person treated unfairly, and the least that a person in the dominant caste can do is not to make the pain any worse. And finally, at the very end of the book, she says, with that empathy, with that caring and concern, we then have to take some responsibility. We are not personally responsible for what people who look like us did centuries ago, but we are responsible for what good or ill we do to people alive with us today. We are, each of us, responsible for every decision we make that hurts or harms another human being. We are responsible for recognizing that what happened in previous generations at the hands of or to people who look like us set the stage for the world we now live in, and that what has gone before us grants us advantages or burdens through no effort or fault of our own, gains or deficits that others who do not look like us will often not share. We are responsible for our own ignorance, or, with time and open-hearted enlightenment, our own wisdom. We are responsible for ourselves and our own deeds or misdeeds in our times and in our own space, and will be judged accordingly by succeeding generations. We are responsible for what we know and then what we use that knowledge to do. So I found Caste to be a very compelling depiction of this circumstance and her experiences. I think there are some places that the analysis falls a little short. In one example, I was reading the chapter on hierarchies and how the American governmental system was biased against African Americans, and one of the often cited examples is the fact that when the Social Security Administration was first put into place, it exempted domestic workers and agricultural laborers. They were not entitled to Social Security benefits. You remember what two jobs African Americans primarily worked in? In agricultural work and in domestic service. But it turns out it wasn't only white Southern Democrats that put those provisions in place, because if you worked for a nonprofit, you weren't eligible for Social Security in 1935. If you worked for the government at any level, you weren't eligible for Social Security, and almost no black people worked for the governments in the South in this era. So it wasn't necessarily an anti-black initiative to make that change. So occasionally some of the claims need some historical analysis. And as I said, the connection to contemporary politics, I think it's more complicated than just one nail and one hammer. But the overall depiction of an American society built on structures and with those inherent pieces behind them that make life tough to get through without remembering or without reacting instinctively, those are still part of the reality we experience. And I want to share one last anecdote to conclude. A young dominant caste man, that is a white man, raised in the Depression-era South and been taught well the rules of the caste system and adhered to them. He went north in the mid-20th century and joined the military, and he had to get over a lot of these conditionings that he'd experienced. Up north, on occasion, he found himself in situations where black people were permitted in the same work settings as whites. I thought I was entirely prepared emotionally and intellectually, an editor at Look magazine he was, recalled many years later. But he discovered that he was a captive of his own condition, which he called a certain madness. And here's the story. Every time he reached the point where he had to shake hands with a black person, he felt an automatic revulsion that had been trained into him. He recoiled, even though it had been black women who bathed him as a child, had mixed the dough for his biscuits, and whose touch had not repulsed him when extended in servitude. But when presumed equals, each time I shook hands with a Negro, he said, I felt an urge to wash my hands. Every rational impulse, all that I considered best in myself, struggled against this urge. But the hand that had touched the dark skin had a will of its own and would not be dissuaded from signaling it was unclean. And that is what I mean by madness. And the cure for this madness is knowledge, listening, radical empathy, and taking responsibility.